What is up, everybody? This is the local history version of the Underground Railroad Assignment 13 part of the tic-tac-toe boards. Hopefully you clicked it. You get to, and with this, I'm gonna try something completely new. All right, Sosa's gonna be out of his little box. He's already out of his new box, and he's in the breakfast nook. And we're gonna go on a little mini tour of like 3 different sites around my neighborhood of Florence, Massachusetts, and how much of a role it played in the abolition movement and the Underground Railroad movement. Like basically what's going to happen is, I'm going to show you 3 different places that kind of really capture the essence of Florence, Massachusetts, and abolition. It's like super cool, kind of weird, with a little bit of like a hippie community thing. But abolitionists were in Florence, Mass, and Northampton. Became this like safe haven for them. We have Frederick Douglass coming up to Florence, Mass. Sojourner Truth lived here for a bit and started her movement. This guy David Ruggles came here to get healthy. But we're gonna meet a lot of like local people by the name of Samuel Hill, the Ross, Austin Ross, and a couple others in terms of what they did. So hopefully you are going to enjoy this new version of Sosa outside the box, or basically in another form of a box. But it's going to be close to outside or in my car. Enjoy. All right, stop 1 on the tour of local history with Northampton. Oh, we're going to have a stranger walking in the background. Oh my God. So this whole thing again is talking about how Florence, in the neighborhood I live in now, contributed to the abolition movement. And silk actually became like a form of protest in many ways. So Northampton had a thriving silk industry, mainly because of these factories, like this one. This one's called the Nonotuck Mill. All right, it's beautiful. Looks like a brick building. And these mills were producing silk for cloth, and Northampton was having a thriving industry in the 1840s with this silk stuff, and many abolitionists started to use silk products because they knew cotton products were coming from where? Dun, 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 the plantations in the South. It's all connecting. So because of these thriving silk factories in Northampton, abolitionists started to say, yo, Northampton's kind of a cool place. Let's check it out. So these factories here, all part of that industrialization process, actually kind of played a role in pushing towards abolition. I'm going to go on and stop 2 in a moment. So not only was Northampton and Florence like a home for cool silk industry and like this like abolition movement, but it actually became a stop on the Underground Railroad. So like escaped and fugitive, quote unquote, fugitive slaves would come up through actually Hartford and then on their way to Canada. And Northampton served as a stopping point for fugitive slaves and often as like a link-up point for the conductors to pass off these runaway slaves to the next conductor to usher and guide them up to Canada. And that system kind of actually got started because of what we think from the Florence Historical Society website is this 660 Riverside Drive, these types of mills. And now this little mill, hopefully if it's the correct one, became home to what is called the the Northampton Association for Education and Industry. Now it sounds like a fancy kind of like corporation for education and industry, but actually it was more like a hippie community where these families bought a mill, which would make sense as to why it would be a small one, lived on the top floor of the mill, and lived as like this community in which they would share foods and meals and then share responsibilities down in the factory to produce silk still. But not only did it stop there, but this Northampton Association for Education and Industry became like, they were very liberal-minded folks, very open-minded, so they quickly became involved in the abolition movement. And this guy by the name Samuel Hill who we'll go see his house in a moment, became the treasurer for this organization, became one of the founders, and really kind of like made this organization boom in the abolition movement. It was known as the Community, and they were hoping to try and create a more pure and like better society to get rid of these issues that were going on in the United States society, such as slavery. Um, but this organization had, like, it became this widespread network where abolitionists like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, oh, the connections, actually came to Florence to be part of this community. And Frederick Douglass spoke up in Florence a bunch of times and wrote about Florence. Sojourner Truth actually lived here for like 7 years and started her big wave in the abolition movement in Florence. This man by the name of David Ruggles, who we're going to go meet in a couple minutes, well, actually, we're going to go see his house, was also a huge part of this organization up in Massachusetts, Florence. So, yeah, it all started with, again, a little silk mill, and starting through economics. Here we're going on to the next stop. Okay, so this is actually a private residence, but this is, or was, the home of a guy by the name of Samuel Hill. We may have to do this like film and go, so I apologize if it's rushed, but Samuel Hill was the treasurer and one of the founders of the Northampton Association for Education and Industry, that like hippie community, that utopian society. Now, this house is super notable for the Underground Railroad because Samuel Hill bought this house from the Northampton Silk Company in 1841. And while he lived at this house, he would open the doors to, it would be a full-on stop at the Underground Railroad, or for the Underground Railroad. His son is stated, his son's long gone, but his son stated, quote, "A good many passengers stopped, quote, for 5 minutes for refreshments at my father's, and conductors were often changed here." So this house, Northampton itself, was a stop for the Underground Railroad, and many houses in the area were stops, but Samuel Hill not only founded the NAEI, which became this hub for abolitionists in this community that supported abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, David Ruggles, William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth, but he himself opened his own house up to runaway slaves. He had slaves who would stay here for 5 minutes and longer, and they would essentially, like, one person, one conductor, would drop off the fugitive slave runaway to Samuel Hill's house, and another conductor would pick up that family or that person and then try to help them get to Canada for true freedom. And Samuel Hill, it's important to note, was a white guy. And so this Underground Railroad movement was aided by those people, by just everybody who believed in this abolition movement. So it's just like super cool. Hill didn't stop here. In 1852, Hill sold property on this site to an ex-slave by the name of Basil Dorsey, who ran away. He was able to escape slavery, and Hill helped set up a lifestyle for Basil Dorsey and his future family. Hill also gave more land to a slave by the name of William Wright, or ex-slave William Wright, to set up his life. Hill founded the Nonotuck Silk Companies, which we actually were just filming at, and provided money for the Florence Sewing Machine Company and invested in what is now in Florence Savings Bank. But the cool thing is, the Florence Sewing Machine Company and a button company employed fugitive slaves, runaway slaves. So he supports these factories that are actually employing free blacks who've escaped from slavery. The house is even better. In 1849, Hill sold this house to Austin Ross, who also then said, okay, I'm going to make this house I'm going to continue the legacy of aiding the Underground Railroad. So Austin Ross sheltered fugitive slaves still after Hill sold it to him. And there's according to records, one runaway slave stayed here for an entire year under the protection of Austin Ross. It's like the awesome symbol and like physical proof of like the extent and power of the Underground Railroad. Simple houses like this aided so many people into escaping slavery and into freedom. And like right in our backyard, where I personally live, but also like Springfield's backyard. Like that's awesome, super awesome. One more stop of the Sossa out of his box into a different outside box. Okay, this is going to be super quick. Well, actually, I'm going to start moving, but this was where the abolitionist David Ruggles, oh my god, we're filming someone's car. David Ruggles, an abolitionist, resided when he was here as part of the Northampton Association for Education and Industry, founded by Samuel Hill. Now, David Ruggles is... Yeah, you're good to go. Thanks. Hey, everybody. Featuring my wife. So David Ruggles was an abolitionist mainly in New York, and he was not just like he was born in Connecticut to a free African American family. So, but he didn't just use his privilege to just sit there and do nothing. He became active in New York mainly, and while the Fugitive Slave Act was allowing for these like kidnappers to go and capture free blacks who were born and free and then sell them illegally into slavery, or capture runaway slaves and then sell them back into slavery, David Ruggles would actually physically fight back and led this vigilance organization to fight back against these kidnappers, kind of like a vigilante group almost. And David Ruggles, he would get into physical fights with them, and he actually survived a lynching, like his own lynching, and survived a kidnapping and escaped his own kidnapping to be sold into slavery. So, if you go back to look at the Fugitive Slave Act, it allowed for these bands of like kidnappers to go and just take free black people and sell them back into the South. So David Ruggles suffered from all of his injuries after being beat up so many times for fighting back against these kidnappers that he came up to Florence and actually started this Florence had this like weird water recuperation treatment community or facility in which you could treat and heal your injuries through water. And so he actually went blind because of his beatings. And through his water treatment, David Ruggles actually started to gain more sight while he was in Florence. So it was Florence kind of was like this. It harbored these activists. Now David Ruggles is also known he's also notable because he became a mentor for Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. But not only that, David Ruggles assisted in escaping and freeing 600 slaves in his lifetime, and one of those was actually Frederick Douglass. And then he found a safe haven here in Florence for his treatment. So this local history is like so cool and fascinating, and it's just around us, and you kind of don't even know, because that house I've driven by so many times and had no idea David Ruggles lived there. So super fascinating, super cool stuff. Yeah. Right. And there's one last stop. This is the house of an absolutely insane history teacher from the Springfield Renaissance School. No, so that concludes the local history Florence Underground Railroad chapter of this huge lesson on the Underground Railroad. Just remember that all of this stuff is super powerful, and it takes so many different people to lead this movement. But the Underground Railroad was people who were, a lot of these people were just like, hey, I hear the value of speeches, I hear the value of these rebellions, but I just want to physically help people escape. And that's exactly what the Underground Railroad did. These people, and oftentimes they were the people who were the conductors and organizing this Underground Railroad were slaves themselves, and they escaped and they went back to help, like Harriet Tubman. And sometimes they were free blacks like David Ruggles. And it's just like a super cool thing, and it's all over, and Northampton and Florence was just a stop in this larger system. So, hope you enjoyed, and all the history in the world is produced from this household. See you later, everybody. Also, this is the alternate ending, because my wife had a better idea. This is the Sossa box. It's beautiful. But no, that's where everything is produced. Woo! Alright, see you later. Sossa box. We are currently getting in position for the big reveal of what just appears to be a giant brick building. But it's really a mill. Pause for relocation. This is Johnson's Sossa, Florence of the Underworld
Could
excursion.
come up from this side. Here.